If you think your future at work gets decided during performance reviews, you're misunderstanding how this actually works. Most people assume that promotions, role changes, budget cuts, and protection decisions happen inside formal processes. They don't. And by the time you're sitting in a review meeting, most of the real decisions have already been made. And the uncomfortable part? You probably weren't in the room when that happened. Not because you're unimportant, not because someone hates you, but because the conversation wasn't about performance. It was about risk. It was about alignment. It was about what the organization needs to protect and what it can afford to let go. And those conversations happen early, quietly, informally. And if you've ever felt blindsided by a decision at work, if you've ever thought, I didn't see that coming, this is probably why. Because while you were focused on doing your job well, other people were deciding what happens next. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. I'm Thomas Schmidt, and I've spent over 3 decades as a technology and business executive, including roles as COO, CMO, head of product, leading teams through multiple industry and technology disruptions. Now I work as a consultant helping organizations optimize how they manage technology, streamline operations, and sharpen both their marketing and product strategies. But I also help mid-career professionals reinvent their careers for what's coming next. And that's why I make these videos, to give you practical insights that help you stay relevant, competitive, and excited about your future. And before we dive in, if you find this type of content useful, please make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. It really helps the channel massively and informs YouTube to show this content to more people who need it. Thanks a ton. All right, let's get into it. The shock. Let me describe how this usually unfolds. A senior leader mentions budget pressure in passing. Another brings up long-term priorities. Someone else says, we need to simplify. No names are mentioned yet. No decisions are declared. But in that moment, the real conversation has already started. Because when organizations shift, whether due to economic pressure, restructuring, AI adoption, or strategic pivots, the first thing that leadership does is not review performance scores. They review exposure. They ask which roles are critical, which functions are defensive, which teams can absorb cuts, who's easy to move, who creates risk if removed. These discussions happen weeks, sometimes months before any announcement reaches you. And by the time HR formalizes the process, the map has already been drawn. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people think they're being evaluated based on how well they execute tasks. But leadership is often evaluating something else entirely. They're evaluating stability, leverage, replaceability, and narrative. Not in a malicious way, but in a survival way. Organizations protect what they believe protects them. And if you're not part of that internal protection conversation, your career trajectory can shift without you ever realizing the discussion took place. Recognition. Think back to a moment when something at work changed unexpectedly. A project was reassigned. A role was redefined. A promotion went to someone you didn't anticipate. Or worse, a position was eliminated and you didn't see it coming. On the surface, it looked procedural, organizational, business-driven, but internally it felt personal. You replayed your performance. You questioned whether you missed something. You wondered if you weren't visible enough, or strategic enough, or connected enough. But here's what most people don't realize. Surprises in your career usually don't mean you failed. They mean you weren't part of the conversation that mattered. Because by the time the formal process reaches you, leadership has already made a directional decision. The review meeting is confirmation. The restructuring announcement is execution. The promotion discussion is closure. The real debate, the one that shaped the outcome, happened before any of that. And it likely revolved around questions you weren't even thinking about. Where is this company exposed? Who reduces uncertainty? What positions are defensive? What talent is expandable? And if you've ever felt blindsided, it's not necessarily because you misjudged your performance. It's because you misjudged the criteria being used. Sometimes the moment looks small. A meeting invite that doesn't include you anymore. A project that quietly shifts to another team. A strategy session that happens without your input, even though your work touches it. Well, you tell yourself it's temporary. You tell yourself it's administrative. You tell yourself it doesn't mean anything. But patterns matter. And when you're no longer included early, It's usually because someone has already simplified the map. They've reduced the number of voices they think they need. They've decided where authority sits, and they've chosen who's essential to the next phase and who is adjacent to it. Most professionals only realize this when something formal happens. A restructure, a title change, a lateral move disguised as opportunity. But those formal changes are rarely the beginning. They're the end of a conversation that started long before. And if you weren't aware that conversation was happening, you were never positioned inside it. And that difference changes everything. What actually drives decisions? When leadership evaluates the future, they're not asking who worked the hardest. They're asking something more structural. They're asking, well, if conditions change, who strengthens our position? If revenues tighten, where do we absorb impact? If priorities shift, who becomes essential and who becomes flexible? That's the lens. Performance matters, but performance alone doesn't create protection. What drives decisions is strategic leverage, and leverage means your presence expands the organization's options. Protection means your absence creates friction. If removing you forces rethinking strategy, slows execution, or increases uncertainty, you're going to be difficult to cut. On the other hand, if removing you simply redistributes tasks across others, well, you're being evaluated. That distinction is rarely visible from your desk. Most professionals define their value by output, but leadership defines value by dependency. And dependency is not about how busy you are. It's about whether the system bends without you. And here's the part that most people never see. Decisions are heavily influenced by who speaks for you when you're not in the room. Executive conversations always include informal advocates. Someone who says, we can't move forward without this, or that role anchors this initiative. If no one makes the argument on your behalf, well, the absence of advocacy becomes part of the evaluation. Not loudly, not maliciously, quietly. And quiet decisions are often the ones that shape careers most dramatically. Why performance isn't enough? Well, this is where most capable professionals get stuck. They assume that doing excellent work guarantees protection, but it doesn't, because execution is visible to your manager, but protection is determined above your manager. You can exceed expectations, you can deliver consistently, you can be dependable, responsive, technically strong, and still be absent from conversations that determine who stays and who advances. Why? Well, because performance proves you can operate. It doesn't prove you change outcomes. It doesn't prove you alter strategic direction. It doesn't prove that the organization is safer with you than without you. Leadership thinks in terms of exposure. They think in terms of trade-offs. They think in terms of impact beyond task completion. So if your value is defined narrowly, even if you define it as excellent, you become categorized. And once you're categorized, you're easier to evaluate as movable, mergeable, or replaceable. Not because you failed, but because you didn't expand your perceived influence. And that difference between performing and shaping is where many careers quietly stall. What to start watching? Well, if decisions are being made without you, the first step is not to panic. It's to observe. Start paying attention to where conversations are happening. Who gets referenced in leadership updates? Whose projects are described as critical? Which teams are framed as defensive versus experimental? Notice the language. Listen for shifts. And when budget discussions arise, whose roles are described as foundational? When priorities change, whose work is repositioned as essential? Most signals are subtle. They show up in tone, not announcements. They show up in who gets looped into cross-functional meetings. They show up in who's asked for input early versus informed late. The people who stay protected are rarely surprised. Not because they're smarter, but because they understand the currents inside of the organization. And if you're not watching those currents, you can be highly competent and still unaware that the tide is moving around you. Awareness doesn't fix everything, but ignorance guarantees vulnerability. Controlled resolution. You can't force yourself into every room, and you can't control every leadership decision, and you can't eliminate organizational risk. But you can stop assuming that performance alone determines your future. And once you understand that decisions are made in risk conversations, and not just review meetings, you stop optimizing only for output, and you start optimizing for presence, for positioning, for alignment. That doesn't mean becoming political. It means becoming aware, because the most dangerous place to be in your career isn't underperforming. It's being evaluated by criteria you didn't know were being used. And once you see that clearly, you're no longer surprised by how decisions happen. You're prepared for them. And if this resonated with you, please comment below. I read everyone. And if you want practical guidance for navigating mid-career challenges, make sure you're subscribed. Because the earlier you take ownership, the more options you keep. Until next time, take care, be kind to yourself, and keep leaning into what makes you strong. And I'll see you in the next one.